Hi everyone. Hello. Thank you so much for coming here tonight as we hear from author Mayhew Bergman discuss her new book, How Strange a Season. My name is Norella and I'm the Events and Social Media Coordinator here at Flyleaf Books. And I want to say thank you for purchasing a copy of Megan's book from us. It really helps us to bring more events like this one to you in the future. To make our events more accessible, we are recording tonight's event, and it will be up in our YouTube channel within a few days. And lastly, we are asking the authors to conclude by 7 p.m. so that we can be mindful of our colleagues who are closing up the store. And now I'll do a brief intro for both of them. So Megan Mayhew Bergman is the author of Almost Famous Women and Birds of a Lesser Paradise. Her short fiction has appeared in 2 volumes of the Best American Short Stories and on NPR's Selected Shorts. She has written columns on climate change and the natural world for The Guardian and the Paris Review. She teaches literature and environmental writing at Millbury College, where she also serves as the director of the Red Loaf Environmental Writers Conference. And fun fact, she lives in a small farm in Vermont. She's joined tonight by Jill McCorkle, whose first 2 novels were released simultaneously when she was just out of college, and the New York Times called her a born novelist. Since then, she has published 5 other novels and 4 collections of short stories, and her work has appeared in the Best American Short Stories several times, as well as the Norton Anthology of Short Fiction. 5 of her books have been New York Times notable books, and her novel, Life After Life, was a New York Times bestseller. Thank you.
Hi there, Jill.
I gotta turn on. Am I on? Yes, now yes.
It's good to see you.
Oh, it's so good to be here. I am such a fan. And so it is just a real honor to be here with Megan. Who I've known for now how many years?
I want to say it's definitely over a decade.
It's
Well
definitely over a decade. And I love this new collection. I love the way it fits the trajectory of what you have been doing in the other 2 collections, because you really are chronicling the journey of women and this almost archetypal transition, which we'll get to the hag, who I love, in a little bit. But I thought it might be great for you to just begin by reading a little bit before we go into the greater conversation.
Sure. Well, first, I want to thank Flyleaf for having me again. I appreciate your support of my career. Every time I publish a book, people ask me if I'm a Southern author, and I have an identity crisis because I spent my first 30 years in the South. So I think until I'm 60, I am legitimately a Southern author. I don't know, what is the test, Jill? Do you know?
I think you always have a foot.
Yeah.
Open your mouth, the accent.
Right. Well, when I'm with Jill, I'm at home, and so I think I have like a reflexive at-homeness with you, which I've always appreciated, and which was actually really meaningful. So I grew up in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, which there's a beautiful representation of here tonight. Maybe mostly now based in the front. And spent some time in South Carolina, and then moved to Vermont when I was 30, and I just had my first daughter, and that was when I published my first book as well. So, all the questions started, are you a Southern writer? And I think my imagination was absolutely forged in the South, so I can't really imagine ever being anything else. It's what I return to artistically. I mean, Jill, you lived away from the South for a while. Did that stay true for you when you were away?
I think I always felt I had a foot in each camp, and having kids grow up in a different place also changes the allegiance somewhat, which you have. You're raising daughters in Vermont.
Yeah. Only one of them can do a Southern accent. The other one said, when she was younger, she was like, I don't speak Southern. I was like, okay, that's fine. So I have my biological parents here, and I want to say thank you to them. This book is dedicated to them and to my North Carolina family. And I also want to say nothing I read or say that's spicy or abhorrent is their fault. It's all mine.
That's very Southern,
Isn't
that
Southern?
disclaimer.
That disclaimer. I always tell my students at Middlebury, there's a Jane Hirschfeld quote, and she says, in order to write well, you need to open the window a few inches wider than is comfortable. And I think about that a lot, of like, how do we push the needle? How do we make it count? How do we make it matter? And often that means, writing some uncomfortable things or things that you wouldn't want to read in front of your mother. Or your father. But I think, Dad might be a little more flexible with me on that. But I also want to say thank you to Jill and Alan here, who Alan also is from Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and when I was growing up, his books were on every shelf. The Oldest Living Confederate Widow Tells All, but also as I got older and I was looking for mentors of people who had the Southern upbringing I had, but also had spent time in New York and Boston and elsewhere and moved around, but integrated that sense of worldliness into a Southern identity and a progressive Southern identity where we didn't have a lot of role models for that. And so I think of you guys, you probably don't want me to claim you as literary parents, but it's a really beautiful literary parentage, and as far as models and people that I really revered growing up, as having dignified literary careers that didn't always fit what the New York literary system wanted, I think, but were still expansive and beautiful and deeply Southern still. So I've always respected and admired you guys and looked up to you so much. So thank you for being here to support me tonight.
Well, I am honored in that role, and I'm sure Alan is. And it's so funny, but I would love to hear you read a little bit, but the sentence that I kept coming back to, well, there are many, because the writing is just beautiful, but in the wonderful story Workhorse, the father is talking about what he misses from his childhood, all these different winds, and he talks, is it the Mistral? Is that how you say it? Mm-hmm. It was the Mistral that he missed. He told me that night when I was sick, the wild, warm wind that shaped him. It could bend a sturdy oak like an old man, making an arc of his body, pointing him south. And I thought, oh, well, that's Megan. That southern wind is always just blowing in little places. So I want you to read a little, but I definitely want to talk about that love of the southern geography, the coast in particular, that keeps coming in.
It is persistent. It is a persistent love, very much so. I'd always imagined myself as a cat lady in Beaufort, North Carolina, and I think that's still where I'm headed. Actually, a cat and dog lady. I do need both to feel complete. I thought, actually, since you mentioned The Hag, that I might read from that, which is the only other time I've ever read from The Hag in public. I cried, so I've had a glass of rosé. I'm going to try not to do that, because I think crying at your own story is like laughing at your own joke. It's really bad form. But as I think a lot about reframing things I thought I understood, but that as I age, I re-understand. And I think womanhood and aging and romantic love, those things I feel consistently reframed. And so at the beginning of Indigo Run, I have a quote from the poet Mina Loy, and it says, women must give up the desire to be loved. And I think about that as an interesting drive in so many people's lives, this desire to be seen, to be loved. And mistakenly, I think sometimes seeing that as a form of completion. And also it's beautiful and I love it. I love love. Let me not pretend that I've hardened myself to love. I haven't. But The Night Hag is a sort of reframing of a figure that comes up in lots of international mythologies. This sort of, it's a crone figure, Baba Yaga. You've seen it in many different ways. But I thought, what if we looked back on this hag figure, this haint figure, with a little bit more compassion? Why is she the way she is? So the whole book concludes with this sort of respun narrative, and it's called The Night Hag. Cousin of Eve, the hag was born not from a rib, but from a fish egg in a stream that cut through a verdant coastal forest. She emerged glistening. Her fresh skin could breathe the air, and she lengthened into the shape of a woman. When she came of age, she sat in a virgin cypress tree like a leopard, one leg dangling. She maintained a remarkable appetite for figs and fresh kills, all of which stained her lips deep crimson. She was a well-kept secret. The forest held her that way, hidden in the vine-choked trees. But the men could feel her there. They could smell the mink oil she put in her thick black hair, and they began to imagine what she could give them. They lined up underneath her tree. They opened their mouths like foxes and waited for something delicious to drop. She laughed and looked, but never planned to come down. The story said she had to wait until she found true love, and she would know it at once. True love is the great salvation, the story said. It will give direction to your life. And one day a man with brown eyes brought her the feather of a pheasant. He came every morning bringing her cherries and figs, blossoms for her hair. And flattered, she let her guard down and grazed the man's mouth with the tip of her toe. She closed her eyes, readying herself, but he pulled her down by the foot, laughing as he did it, leaping on top of her, and then he left. She waited the next morning and the next 100 mornings for him to return with cherries and figs, but he did not. And she could not climb back into the cypress tree. She did not know how to hunt, and her sadness became venom. She sat in the weeds, egrets nesting in her rich hair while the sun caught on their blinding white plumage. The hag could see now the stories she had been fed, all of her learned incompetence, her false innocence, and when she smelled it on other women, her stomach turned. Never believe the stories, she whispered to them. Topless, she rode the white stag into town to the nearest tavern. The hag wore a necklace of olive shells that fell between her breasts and a strong perfume of musk from a deer she had killed. She rented a room over the bar where she tied war heroes and sea captains to the brass bed with baling twine and exhausted them until she felt some revenge had been taken and some balance restored. I am not the girl you thought I was, she yelled into the throngs of men downstairs. At night, she lay in her bed of swan down and smoked a cigarette, satisfied until her thoughts turned again to the men who had pulled her from the cypress tree and left her alone underneath the hanging moss. Was there no peace? She ripped up fistfuls of grass with her bare hands and threw it into the air, drank vodka, gave herself a new haircut in case she ran into him in town. So, yeah, a little fun with retelling a tale with a little vodka.
No, she's fabulous, and that whole line, never believe the stories, resonates so much because it's not just within the life of an individual who might have been misled. You're writing so much about history and legacy and what people inherit just by way of being alive, the crimes that have come before, or whatever has happened, and so it resonates in so many ways, and also with the environment. I mean, you never believe the stories, so we get to the end, and the hag is someone well aware of all the ways that you might be deceived or misled, which is both a strong position but also an uncomfortable one. So I thought talk a little bit about that, because you really do tackle the archetypes and the different positions of women. I mean, I kind of love wife days, It's like I can be the wife these 4 days and then the 100 days. I mean, so you're really tackling all the sort of stereotypical roles in the present, but also through history, and in particular, the novel certainly takes on, and also your monkfish, having inherited a difficult legacy, whether it dealt with racism or women being held down.
Yes. When I was giving a reading in New England, sometimes I feel like I have to, what's the word for it? It's not mansplaining, but when you have to explain the South to people who have, only imagine it as this monolithic place where everyone's the same. And I came across, people kept calling this book an example of the Southern Gothic. And I was wondering, I was like, am I Southern Gothic? And I looked up the official definition, and it said, Oxford defines the characteristics of Southern Gothic as including the presence of irrational, horrific, and transgressive thoughts, desires and impulses, grotesque characters, dark humor, and an overall angst-ridden sense of alienation. So I have some of that. And then the next part said, the Southern Gothic brings to light the extent to which the idyllic vision of the pastoral agrarian South rests on massive repressions of the region's historical realities, slavery, racism, and patriarchy. Southern Gothic texts also mark a Freudian return of the repressed. The region's historical realities take concrete forms in the shape of ghosts that highlight all that has been unsaid in the official version of Southern history. I know, when I read that, I was like, oh, also check. So I planned to resist Southern Gothic, and now I think I'm just going to wallow in it. But I think it's interesting to think about what a new Southern Gothic looks like, and how to, I think I trust readers and admire readers a lot, and that's something I feel like Bennington, you and Amy taught me to do really well, which is, to know that readers are intelligent and they understand a lot on the page. So I try to never come at it with too much righteousness, because I think readers are allergic to righteousness. So thinking about how can we be in the complexity of these issues, and how can we think about systemic issues in fiction without being too righteous. So usually I try to do that just by honoring complexity, making people messy, especially women. It's really artistically important to me to let women be unlikable and ugly on the page as much as possible, and to throw elbows out a little bit that way, just in terms of an expansive notion of how a woman can be and how much a woman can feel and the range of that feeling. So I also have 2 daughters, and I will say that factors into my thinking a lot about, the Southern lady training that a lot of us in this room received, right? Which is about being pleasing and appealing and agreeable. And I think I told Jill this over drinks, but yesterday I asked my oldest daughter, Frasier, I was like, do you want a webcam before my event? And she said, that's a sweet offer, but now is not a good time for me. And I was completely heartbroken, and I also really admired her use of boundaries, which I figured out how to do last year. So I really am interested in letting women, including my daughters, have that sort of agency, and to risk being unlikable, and to risk hurting feelings, and to risk not being pleasing, even if that's going to come at me a lot. But I have to admit that I look at each book as sort of corresponding to some age of awareness that I was kind of dawning into, and this book has a lot of, I'm aging, I'm in my 40s now, which is very different than the 29-year-old who wrote my first book, which feels very vulnerable to me, that first book. How do you feel, looking back at all your work, can you see different versions of yourself?
Totally, yeah. No, and your second book, the Almost Famous Women, is like the perfect bridge between those 2 worlds, I think. Kind of one step removed, these, which if you haven't read that one, it's a wonderful collection. But this one has a rawness and a fierceness. I was going to say there's this wonderful thread of anger that we see in the hag, and it's coming to that place of enough. I can do something about this. So all of these women are so action oriented. You know, they all have a plan, and I love in Inheritance, you know, with the demolition stuff, which is great. These men pay to come and like wreck things, and this woman is in control of it all. You know, and there's this one sentence where, you know, she knows that when they leave, she's going to go out there and finish it off herself. You know, there's just this wonderful anger, but there's also retribution throughout, and characters seeking a kind of forgiveness of the kind of guilt you're talking about that often gets handed down. So you're tackling all the big things, and I felt like I feel in many ways the hag, cousin of Eve, brought it all full circle in terms of this journey.
I think you really are my ideal reader. You just said everything that I would want someone to notice about the book. I feel like now would be also a very good time to thank my therapist. I think we really do ideally grow as writers with each book, but I think that growth as a writer for me has often been a sort of post-traumatic enlightenment, or these moments where I feel like I've grown as a human being or a woman or a thinker because of things I've seen or experienced in the world, and I believe I bring that to my fiction every time, ideally to my journalism as well. But I remember distinctly a conversation with my therapist, and I was like, you know, this happened to me, and this was done to me, and she was like, also you did this to yourself, which is head spinning, and exactly the kind of thing that I find useful, which is our passive participation in systems, and the ways, you know, a line that I didn't put in the book that I kept thinking about was the pretty bird likes her cage, but this idea of sometimes we are benefiting from systems or participating in them, and we think, oh, I can't help it, or this is just the way it is, and what it means to pull back and say, I can have agency, I can change something, I can take control, and there's also a lot of women working, which I appreciated you saying. I remember Amy and David once in a workshop giving a spiel about, you know, I think a lot of us had just turned in stories where no one worked. and
everybody needs a job.
Everybody needs a job, turns out. And so I think a lot about the connection of work and empowerment and agency, and tried to bring that to some of these stories.
Yeah, and they're wonderful thematic threads connecting. The stories the characters are so different, and what they're doing in life so different, and yet thematically I feel like there's so much connection, and just a couple of places that I think are so beautifully done in the heirloom. And forget, it's the heirloom that's the construction site. Yeah. Sorry about that. This paragraph, that was what happened, wasn't it? She thought people were engaged in a cycle of coming and going, perpetually deciding to stay or to leave. Sometimes they returned after a mental absence, you never knowing they'd left in the first place, lying next to you in the dark, as she did with Keenan, thinking of life on the other side. And again, you take us in Inheritance. Then you have, it's different, but connects, because you have the man you love could climb in bed beside you, she thought, and return to another woman in the recesses of his mind, like Charlie did, or Michael, who must have spent many nights next to her, thinking of someone else. So you open these broad topics, but you keep bringing us back to the soul of the individual, kind of the responsibility of the individual to either accept or not, to act or not. Even the wonderful in the lionfish story, there's a character who, out of his own sense of guilt, sort of ties him, is tied to a dock sustaining these hurricane winds, and he's just being lashed by nature, which that's one of the most powerful images in the whole book for me. But that's the dramatic version of these other quiet moments, because again and again we see individuals struggling for this kind of survival, you know, within the bigger scene. And I'm curious, I'm jumping all around, sorry, but I'm very curious where the image, that amazing image of the hurricane winds and him out in that dock.
This is going to be a surprise answer.
Came to you, okay.
So my very stoic Vermont father-in-law told me he'd heard a story about a man who tied himself to piers for sport. And I think in my mind, just given the political climate and things I was thinking about guilt and the sort of almost nearly impossible quest for redemption and self-flagellating behavior and what we might do. And so I, did what most fiction writers do, is that I stole something from reality and I, put it into that scene. And I located it in the town of Alligator, North Carolina. Do you guys know that? It's kind of Inner Banks region. And the story about Lionfish is really about displacing agency in some ways, of looking for other people to solve problems that you helped create, and also the savior complex, which I'm really fascinated by. I mean, I think I have a little of one in myself. So often when I'm exploring things in my fiction, I'm often thinking about, what is this mess within me, or what is this thing I'm afraid I'm carrying?
And it definitely, I mean, you are you're taking on climate change, you're taking on the history of the South in the novella. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the novella, because it's pretty amazing, the historical expanse there. Where did that begin?
So that was supposed to be a novel that is a novella. And that's the unpretty answer, is that I probably cut 40,000 words from that. There was a subplot that I think just didn't quite land, but the skeleton of it was so important to me. I don't know if any of you guys, I know several of you in here are writers. You have material that you think, one day I hope to be a good enough writer to handle this, to tackle this. And this sort of idea was, what if we inherited something that was a curse and not a blessing? What if, our standards of beauty, like I think it's a nearly $1 billion hospitality plantation industry where people, do weddings and kind of hold plantation aesthetics up as beautiful. What if we shouldn't? And how complex is that, and what would it mean if somebody who had inherited one of those buildings questioned it? So it's, like a lot of people in the last few years wondering, what's toxic inside of me? What am I carrying? What aesthetic choices? What problems? But trying to locate it in the self and not trying to blame it on everyone else.
Right. No, it's such a complicated situation. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there it's just really front and center. But you come to those complicated places throughout. Another one that I was really intrigued by is Inheritance. Wait, do I have it right? The demolition.
Oh, the heirloom.
The heirloom.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That earth house, which is so interesting. The mother was really quite a feminist, having taken in these women, and so now here she is living there, and kind of, it's such an interesting duality, this living underground with the demolition going on. Talk a little bit about, because that is one of the angrier kind of lively pieces there's just so much going on in that story.
Yeah, it's
Because
probably
she's almost like a dominant. Well, she's been
taking classes from a
taking
dominatrix.
classes from a dominatrix to sort of get the power thing right. So it's all about power. And yet, that was her voice that I read. That sort of quiet, introspective voice, which is why I think that was so moving to me, because we're not seeing that. And then kind of like being inside this underground house. That's where she was.
I think you're right that there's a lot happening in that story in terms of power dynamics. So, I'm 5'2", I'm smiley, I love a joke. But I also have moments where I would like to be in charge, or I would like to be given power, or I think I've earned it professionally, and feeling, that I have to work a little harder for it than I would like. And so I'm interested in power dynamics. I'm interested in presumptions. And one day I did get an email from a very entrepreneurial dominatrix who was offering classes on power dynamics and how people speak to one another. And I had a moment where I was like, I might buy that class, because I feel like there's something I need to know about how to have power in a conversation, because it's not something that came to me naturally. And I am affectionate. I do love to support others. And so a lot, as a mother, as a partner, as an empathetic person, I'm often really fascinated by that decision point where we think, when do I serve myself and when do I serve someone else? Or when do I save myself and when do I save someone else? And so there's a lot of that running through the book about just the self and others and community and the real joy and meaning we might take from those acts of service, and how profound and important they are, and how they can also be problematic over time. So I don't have any beautiful answers on that, but as Rilke says, about being in love with the problems, I think that's usually where I am.
Yes, and just one of the great, I'm terrible on time. I'm going to, the Glass House is.
I might be terrible on my titles too.
No.
Inheritance is the Glass House
Yes.
in California.
Yes. That one is so clear. She's inherited this glass house on the side of a cliff, and it's really threatened by the slides. And so there, the metaphor is at work with this precarious position and the choices. But again, what runs through is she inherited that house. And the Earth House was left to that character. So we have this ongoing theme of what's given to you, your legacy, and what you have to determine is worth saving. That's in many ways a big takeaway from the stories, don't you think?
Absolutely. And the interesting thing is, this young woman in this story idolized this modernist glass house, and she idolized this grandmother figure who's actually I got inspired after a Vivian Gornick lecture. So Vivian Gornick is the grandmother. That's off the record. It probably wasn't off the record in
But
any
that's
way.
a real smart grandmother.
Yeah, it's a real smart grandmother who didn't make the decision to care for others and self-sacrifice, but chose herself. And so this young woman grew up idolizing her and this lifestyle, only to realize that this woman didn't love her as much as she thought, but she'd inherited this glass house on a cliff. And I wrote this when I was in Big Sur. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but I was there for a speaking engagement during the time where they had mudslides that had closed off two sides of the road, and I had to drive a really bad rental car over a military road over the mountain one way. And it was just sort of that moment where I was like, maybe I'm going to die. I don't know if you've had that in a rental car, but that was a very real moment. So that sense of place was so strong for me, and I thought, what a gorgeous, rich subculture and place. And I loved the modernist houses, and I loved the sort of echoes of Henry Miller in the 60s in that time. And then I could just see that it was going to slide into the ocean, this sort of precarity of such beautiful things. But then I also thought, we have to watch what we love sometimes, or watch what we idolize. I had a friend who intimidates me. When you're a writer, you can have a lot of intimidating friends, and I have a friend who's, her name is Veronica, and she's a poet. And once she turned to me fairly savagely and was like, "You valorized the wrong things," and then just sort of walked out of the room. And but I find that really useful. I mean, sometimes I think, am I valorizing the wrong thing? Am I drawn to the wrong thing? But that's part of that story.
Yeah, and well, I shouldn't give away. I do love I love the end where she's seeking a safe place, but it is a place she no longer recognized. So again, it's coming to this place that's different enough, it seems, for change. So now I am going to ask the hard question, even though you have home family.
Okay, I'm ready.
Because you grew up, well, this from someone whose mother for years has said if anybody mentioned my work, you don't want to read her books. You'll never find her books in the Christian bookstore. So anyway, so see, it's already better.
It's already better.
But you're definitely dealing with a foot in these two camps. I mean, you live in Vermont, and and you have the southern roots, and certainly there's a lot of progressive movement in the South.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully more and more. But you yourself are quite an activist and naturalist. And so how is it all balancing? Your daughters are growing up in a very different place. So you do wear many, many hats. And I think we see this with the women in the stories. But I'm just wondering how you are juggling it these days, because you're accomplishing a lot in the world, as a mother, as a writer, but just also your voice about climate change and politics.
Thank you for saying all that. I mean, of course, I love hearing it, and you've known me since even before I went to Bennington, we met at NC State for a fiction contest when I was just writing, and I hope you never remember what that story was about.
Wilton and I were talking about that recently.
No, I hope not. Yeah, I always tell my students you have to write at least 30 bad stories before you get to a good one. I think that might have been like number 12.
No, it was a good story.
As a woman, as a writer, there are a lot of ways to spend yourself, and you'll notice there's a large gap between book 2 and book 3. And I was spending myself in many, many ways during those years. But one thing that I'm thankful for is the courage I have as I age. I am more willing to disappoint people. I am more willing to be in conflict. I was very, very shy and conflict averse when I was younger, and that's my natural setting. Like I still have to kind of count to 10 before I enter into conflict or move in that direction. But I'm an environmental journalist for The Guardian. I've spent the last 4 or 5 years writing about environmental topics, and that's sort of the thing that brings me to the page. It's hard to bring it to the page in fiction very well, so it takes me a while to think about how to do that and not sound righteous, or to make it more than that. I sometimes feel like I'm weaving this sort of messy web, and there's something about this book that I finally felt like there was some integration and cohesion between all the things I've been trying to think about and become. So I'll take that as a sign of being in my 40s. I think we talk about crises as if they're a bad thing, a midlife crisis as if it's laughable, but I've had like 2 or 3 already, and I'm 42, I think there's something really beautiful and important about taking stock of where you are and asking hard questions and asking what you're participating in or asking what's coming at you and what you want to leave. So, I hope I'm braver on the page and in life in general.
Well, you are, and you certainly acknowledge the power of nature. I mean, I'm not going to call it up specifically, but I found it moving those times in the book where we're pulling for nature, and I have felt it myself sometimes, like when you see the coast being dredged or you see man-made protection of all these things man has put out there at risk, and I catch myself pulling for the ocean, like you can do it. It's yours. And there is something so powerful with honoring the power of nature and not taking it for granted, and in the same way honoring the power of womanhood and what is there. So that's where the two, I felt, if I got to write another comment or review, I mean, it would be that parallel of those two powers. I think she was telling me we're running out of time, so I'm going to see if there's a question in the audience, because some of you may have questions. Or Megan, maybe there's something you want to add that I have failed to bring up.
You just talked about my work so beautifully and generously, so just admiration, nothing to add. Thank you guys for taking your time to be here during a pandemic and during this kind of weird in-between time. It really means a lot to me to have you here. So thank you, and thank you for reading short fiction.
Yeah. I mean, it's so great to be in person and to celebrate this book. So if you have not read these stories, now's the time. And if you missed the ones prior to it, don't, because there's a real progression there. There really is. So thank you, such an honor.
Thank you, Jill.